In the sweltering heart of Mexico, under skies that bleed crimson at dusk, there exists a village few outsiders have ever heard of. And in this village, centuries ago, something happened that science itself still cannot explain. Two children were born, identical twins, yet unlike any humans who had ever lived. Their eyes reflected a knowledge no child should possess, their minds seemingly threaded with secrets that stretched beyond time. What happened next would unsettle the very foundations of what we believe about life, death, and the invisible currents that pull at human destiny. From the first moment they opened their eyes, villagers whispered, not just because of their uncanny resemblance, but because of the events that seemed to follow them like shadows. Animals would behave strangely in their presence. Crops would either flourish in impossible abundance or rot without reason. Nightly storms seemed to obey the twins' moods, lightning striking not randomly but with precision, as if some unseen intelligence was conducting the heavens. The government records from the time are scarce, but they do exist, fragmented, heavily redacted. Officially, the twins were remarkable cases of neurological anomaly, yet local elders, those who dared to speak, told stories of rituals, of cloaked figures moving in silence through the village, studying the twins as though they were a map to some ancient truth humanity had long forgotten. And there were warnings, carved into the village stones in symbols older than the Spanish conquest. Some knowledge will devour the mind that seeks it too eagerly. What follows is not merely a tale of twins with strange powers, it is a descent into a hidden history, the kind that governments, scientists, and institutions have tried to erase or twist, yet the echoes remain. You, watching now, are standing at the threshold of that knowledge. What you are about to hear is not safe for casual ears. It is dangerous, illuminating, and transformative. Before we go further, take a moment. Look around where you're watching this. Comment your city or state below. Claim your presence in this unfolding truth. And if you're ready, subscribe, because once we move forward, there's no turning back. The twins grew, and with each passing year, their difference from ordinary humans became undeniable. It wasn't just intelligence, it was perception. They could anticipate events before they happened. Villagers swore they could sense danger, not like intuition, but with precise, cold certainty. One day, a landslide threatened the village. The twins appeared at the edge of the cliff long before the rumble began, guiding families to safety with an authority that was almost unnatural. But every gift carries a price, and with the twins' abilities came attention. Not the attention of curious neighbors, but of forces that move quietly behind the veil of power. Cloaked observers, sometimes hundreds of miles away, began arriving in the village under the guise of scholars, doctors, or missionaries. They took notes, recorded behaviors, and left as if nothing had occurred. Yet the twins could feel them, every glance, every unspoken intention, and they recoiled, whispering about eyes that see without seeing. By adolescence, the twins' abilities had grown beyond comprehension. They began to speak in unison, completing each other's sentences before the thought fully formed. Scholars called it a psychological phenomenon, a shared consciousness. Locals called it something else, a curse, or perhaps a doorway. Every time they spoke, animals fell silent, winds stilled. Even the fireflies seemed to hesitate, as if the world itself recognized that the twins were no longer part of the natural order. And then, the experiments began. Hidden rooms in the village, locked away and forgotten in official maps, held instruments that were decades, even centuries, ahead of their time. Electrodes, sensors, and ancient glyphs intermingled, hinting at a knowledge humanity had lost. The twins were subjects, though no one dared say it openly. They were observed constantly, their every heartbeat recorded, their dreams dissected like fragile blueprints of some cosmic machine. This is where the story turns darker, because what the observers sought was not just intelligence or talent. They wanted control. They wanted to map the human mind, to bend consciousness itself to the will of those who understood the true architecture of reality. And the twins, innocent yet extraordinarily dangerous, were the keys. If you understand this, if you feel the weight of what they were being drawn into, comment. The veil is thin. Twice below, claim your awareness. Because those who see the hidden world cannot remain ignorant. By the time the twins reached their early teens, The observers had become relentless. They were no longer passive watchers. They were manipulators, pulling strings in the shadows, altering the twins' routines, controlling who they spoke to, what they ate, even how they slept. The village that once whispered about them now avoided them entirely, afraid of the unseen forces that seemed to orbit the twins' lives. It was during one of these nights, under a crescent moon that barely illuminated the jagged mountains, that the twins first acted with conscious defiance. A device, meant to record the subtle rhythms of their thoughts, was brought into their room. The observers believed the twins would comply, as always. But that night, they didn't. With synchronized precision, the twins manipulated the device, not just disabling it, but sending back readings that mirrored the observers' own thoughts. The watchers recoiled. Some faltered, unprepared for the mirror of their own intentions reflected in the children's minds. This was the first true rebellion, subtle yet undeniable. But rebellion carries consequences, especially when the forces you defy are older, colder, and more methodical than anything you can imagine. The observers returned the next day, their eyes hollow with restrained fury. The twins, sensing the threat, spoke in whispers that carried over impossible distances, warning the village in riddles, hints, and symbols only a select few could interpret. From that moment, the village became a stage for a psychological war. Every conversation, every glance, every sound carried layers of meaning. The twins were no longer passive participants in life. They had become active architects of perception itself. Dreams became a battlefield. Memories, both theirs and the villagers', were infiltrated by visions too vivid to be ignored. Reality itself began to fracture not outwardly, but in the minds of those who dared to observe too closely. And here is where it deepens, where the forbidden knowledge begins to carve itself into the soul. The twins were beginning to understand what the watchers could not admit, that consciousness is a map, and some maps lead to doors that were never meant to be opened. They were approaching one such door, and those who controlled the instruments of study were about to realize that some doors cannot be shut once the key chooses to turn itself. As the twins grew, the line between human and something far older began to blur. The villagers, once merely wary, now whispered openly about unnatural shadows that followed the children. Objects moved without touch, winds bent around them, and at night, the stars themselves seemed to flicker in unusual patterns, as if signaling to forces no one dared name. It was no longer enough to watch the twins. Fear had infected the very air they breathed. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind jagged mountains, the twins stood at the edge of the river that carved through the valley. The water glowed faintly, almost phosphorescent, reflecting a light that seemed to originate not from the sun, moon, or stars, but from somewhere deeper. The villagers swore that if you stared too long, you could see the twins speaking with shadows, their voices rising in unearthly unison, bending the shapes of the mist into forms that made men stagger backward in terror. Even the animals began to act strangely. Dogs cowered where there was no predator. Birds avoided the sky above their home. Horses refused to cross the fields that the twins trod. The entire ecosystem of the village seemed to bend, as if nature itself recognized that the twins were not ordinary, and with every ripple in reality, the watchers in cloaks grew more obsessed, more desperate, more violent in their concealed operations. The twins were no longer only subjects, they were catalysts. Whatever latent force they carried, something prehistoric, something forbidden, was beginning to leak into the physical world. Strange symbols appeared overnight in the village's empty streets, carved into stone and wood. Villagers who accidentally glimpsed them would awaken screaming, unable to explain the visions that tormented their dreams. Even the elders, those who had once claimed to understand the old ways, began to whisper that the twins were walking gateways, carrying knowledge that should never be released. And so the village became a crucible of terror and awe, caught between the innocence of children and the terrifying power they wielded unconsciously. A storm was gathering, one that could not be contained by fences, laws, or human reasoning. The watchers realized too late that studying the twins was no longer enough. The twins themselves were beginning to rewrite the rules of observation, bending reality into shapes that the human mind was never meant to hold. This is where the descent deepens. Those who think they understand the world will soon find that the world they know is only a fraction of what is real. And you, watching now, are seeing it unfold in real time, a danger and a revelation that few will ever face. Word of the twins began to slip through cracks in the world beyond the mountains. Scholars, travelers, and even journalists stumbled upon whispers of their existence, each account more unsettling than the last. But by the time outsiders arrived, the twins' presence had already altered the very space around the village. Roads would vanish from memory, rivers would change course, and travelers claimed nights that should have lasted hours stretched into endless darkness. Those who came seeking knowledge often left with terror etched into their souls, or vanished entirely. The phenomena could no longer be contained. Objects lifted from the ground without explanation. Sounds of chanting echoed in the distance, though no one was there. Letters written by observers would rewrite themselves overnight, spelling warnings the authors didn't recall composing. Even distant cities reported strange occurrences, electrical grids flickering in patterns, animals behaving with unnatural precision, and dreams that carried the twins' silent, commanding voice. It was as if the world itself was beginning to bend toward them, the subtle architecture of reality responding to forces humanity had ignored for centuries. Government interest escalated. Scientific agencies tried to classify the twins as anomalies, a neurological curiosity, a genetic marvel. But their instruments failed to record what truly mattered. Magnetic fields warped unpredictably. Quantum experiments went awry. Even satellite imagery seemed distorted around the village, as if something in the twins' consciousness reached up through the sky and warped observation itself. The watchers, once content to quietly monitor, were now desperate. Their notes spoke of unstable vectors and anomalous consciousness interference, the kind of language that hints at experiments far beyond human ethics. And then came the first indirect consequences of the twins' awakening. Outsiders who had brushed too close to their energy reported unexplainable memories, sudden premonitions, and subtle compulsions, tiny echoes of the twins' perception seeping into the world. Some claimed to foresee events before they happened. Others felt themselves compelled to act in ways they could not rationalize. The twins' influence was no longer confined to one valley. It was threading into the collective unconscious, a signal no human system could fully comprehend. This is the moment the story escalates. The watchers understood one thing too late. The twins were not a phenomenon to be contained. They were a rupture in the human experience, a fracture through which the hidden mechanisms of reality began to leak into the everyday world. And if you feel the weight of what I'm revealing now, comment below where you are watching from. Anchor yourself in this unfolding truth. The observers had grown bold, confident that decades of meticulous surveillance and control could bend the twins to their will. They'd brought in specialists from across the globe, psychologists, engineers, and esoteric scholars, each armed with instruments designed to measure, map, and ultimately dominate consciousness itself. They believed that with enough manipulation, the twins could be contained, cataloged, and exploited. But they underestimated the intelligence that moved between the two children, as if they were a single entity, a consciousness too fluid, too ancient, too dangerous to be pinned down. The first confrontation occurred in a chamber built for observation, a sterile room meant to reduce the twins to mere subjects. The watchers had placed devices around them, sensors, screens, machines pulsing with artificial signals intended to override the children's perception. The twins, however, did not flinch. Instead, they turned the instruments against their manipulators. Readings returned impossible data, neural patterns that mirrored the observers' thoughts, subtle manipulations of the machines that left scientists questioning their own cognition. The watchers were no longer in control. They were under the twins' scrutiny, exposed in ways they had never anticipated. Psychological warfare escalated rapidly. The twins projected visions, not through speech, but through subtle cues, flickers of light, precise sounds, gestures so small they could be dismissed. Yet the observers could not ignore them. Each cue forced the watchers to confront memories they had buried, fears they had suppressed, and ambitions they had cloaked in rationality. One by one, the specialists began to falter. Their notes devolved into scribbles of fear, Instruments malfunctioned under patterns of thought they could not comprehend. The children had become the architects of a reality the Watchers thought they could define. Outside the chamber, the village felt the reverberations. Winds bent unnaturally, fires flickered against logic, and the land itself seemed to pulse with the twins' will. Any outsider who approached too closely reported dizziness, whispers in unknown languages, and a sensation of being watched by forces that transcended understanding. The twins were no longer just human anomalies. They were conduits, mirrors, and disruptors of perception on a scale the world had never encountered. The first time the villagers truly understood the depth of the twins' power, it happened in the dead of night. A simple flicker of candlelight in their home became the catalyst for phenomena that no human could rationally explain. Shadows stretched and twisted independently, moving against the contours of walls. Windows rattled with no wind. Objects rose, hovered, and then fell in precise sequences, as though the twins' thoughts orchestrated them like a symphony. Fear gripped the village in a way that was tangible, an oppressive, living force pressing against every chest. Even the natural world began to respond. Trees swayed in impossible directions. Water from the river carved new channels overnight. Animals acted in hyper-awareness, avoiding the twins' presence entirely or clustering unnaturally, as if sensing a force beyond comprehension. Lightning struck with impossible accuracy during storms, not in random arcs, but directed toward places the twins merely glanced at. It was no longer a question of anomaly. Reality itself had become elastic, bending around their will. The Watchers, desperate to retain control, attempted to physically intervene. They set up barriers, sensors, even rudimentary containment structures. But each attempt failed spectacularly. Doors sealed themselves, walls warped, and machinery erupted into sparks and smoke as if reality resisted the very concept of confinement. Instruments intended to record their activity produced data so bizarre that scientists began questioning their own sanity. Every reading defied physics, every measurement contradicted logic. The twins' presence was rewriting rules humans had relied upon for centuries. And then came the whispers, a sound carried not through air, but through perception. Those sensitive enough to hear it reported a voice that spoke directly to their consciousness. Bypassing sound entirely, it didn't matter if they were inside the village or miles away. Those whispers carried warnings, riddles, and glimpses of truths that should have remained hidden. Even the observers felt it, trapped between fascination and terror, forced to confront realities their minds were never equipped to process. At this point, the twins were no longer children to be studied. They were forces of nature, capable of bending mind, matter, and perception alike. The village had become a laboratory of the impossible, a crucible of fear, awe, and revelation. And anyone who dared approach, scholar, scientist, or traveler, risked more than curiosity. They risked a fundamental shift in the way they experienced existence itself. If you feel your perception straining under what I'm revealing, comment below where you're watching from, and mark yourself as someone who now glimpses the hidden architecture of reality. By now, it was no longer sufficient to observe the twins from a distance. Their presence had begun to saturate the land itself. The soil seemed to pulse beneath their feet, as if the earth recognized them as more than human. Trees leaned toward their path. Rivers shifted subtly to trace their movements, and even the wind seemed to carry fragments of their thought across the valley. Every step they took left a mark, not just physical, but psychological, imprinting awareness into the land itself. The Watchers, now desperate, escalated their interventions. They attempted to erect barriers, to cordon off the village, to isolate the twins from the influence they were exerting. But the land itself resisted. Fences bent impossibly. Sensors malfunctioned. Attempts to block the twins' movement only seemed to intensify the phenomena. Crops grew in unnatural patterns. Wild animals gathered along invisible lines, and shadows moved in formations that mimicked the twins' synchronized gestures. The very earth had become an extension of their consciousness, a living network radiating influence outward. Villagers noticed the change first in subtle ways. Rain would arrive exactly when it was most needed. Lightning would strike distant threats before they could manifest, and paths that once took hours to traverse shortened mysteriously. Yet these blessings were inseparable from terror. Anyone who entered the valley without permission experienced nausea, vertigo, and vivid hallucinations, as if the land itself was judging their intentions. Those who came to exploit the twins found themselves repelled not by force, but by a conscious intelligence embedded in every stone, every leaf, every current of air. Observers' notes grew frantic. The twins had become a node of awareness, an interface between human consciousness and a living, responsive ecosystem. Attempts to analyze the network produced readings that defied logic. Electromagnetic fields pulsed in patterns too complex for any human or machine to replicate, and instruments recorded signals resembling the rhythm of thought itself. The Watchers were losing control, not because of error, but because the twins had shifted the rules of engagement entirely. This is the point where ordinary understanding fails. The twins were no longer merely alive, they were architecture, a lattice of awareness threaded through flesh, earth, and perception, and those who sought to dominate them were learning, far too late, that the natural order had already chosen its protectors. The Watchers had crossed every ethical boundary, driven by obsession and fear in equal measure. What began as quiet observation had become an aggressive campaign to harness the twins' abilities for purposes no one outside the hidden circles could comprehend. Experiments were conducted in secrecy, instruments more invasive than ever deployed, and networks of agents moved through the surrounding regions like shadows. Yet every attempt to control, predict, or contain the twins only amplified the phenomena they sought to exploit. Beyond the valley, strange occurrences began appearing in other parts of Mexico. Rivers shifted overnight. Crops thrived or failed without explanation. Animals migrated in patterns that confounded scientists. Ordinary citizens reported visions and dreams that echoed fragments of the twins' consciousness. Symbols, warnings, and fleeting glimpses of events yet to come. News outlets dismissed these as isolated anomalies, but the patterns were unmistakable to those trained to see beyond the superficial. The twins' influence had become a global ripple, subtle yet undeniable. Electrical grids experienced fluctuations along precise, impossible rhythms. Satellite data revealed anomalies in geomagnetic activity centered on the valley but radiating across borders. Even remote researchers far from the twins' direct reach began documenting unexplained synchronizations, coincidences too precise to be random. It was as if a network of awareness, anchored by the twins, was reaching into the very fabric of human and environmental systems. Meanwhile, the Watchers' obsession had mutated into desperation. Some began to act erratically, making reckless decisions that compromised their own security and sanity. Internal conflicts erupted as factions argued over methodology and objectives. Instruments, once trusted allies, now failed inexplicably. Teams sent to document the twins' influence reported hallucinations, sudden sickness, and in some cases, vanishing entirely. The Watchers' need for control was being weaponized against them by forces they could neither name nor understand. At the same time, the twins themselves were evolving, their abilities expanding in ways even they barely comprehended. Consciousness, environment, and perception merged into a singular lattice, a living system that responded to thought and intention with terrifying precision. The world was beginning to bend in recognition of their presence, and no human apparatus, no matter how sophisticated, could contain it. This was the point of no return, a conflict, not just of people or power, but of perception itself, a struggle that would ripple across nations and challenge the boundaries of reality. The Watchers' confidence collapsed like glass under pressure. Their sophisticated instruments, meant to measure, predict, and dominate, began malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. Readings contradicted themselves, machines sparked, weird, and shut down without cause. Even human memory seemed to falter around the twins. Entire teams reported forgetting conversations, procedures, and locations only to realize later that they had been subtly guided by forces beyond comprehension. Every attempt to control reality only accelerated its unraveling. Meanwhile, the twins were no longer passive observers of their own environment. The land bent in direct response to their intentions. Rivers carved new paths mid-flow, winds shaped themselves around their movements, and shadows coalesced into forms that hinted at consciousness. Animals became messengers, carrying subtle cues across the valley to anyone approaching with curiosity or malice. Nightfall itself seemed to obey their will, darkness stretching unnaturally or retreating where illumination was needed to reveal hidden truths. The psychological stakes escalated. Villagers reported waking from dreams that bled into waking life, unable to distinguish illusion from reality. Outsiders caught glimpses of scenes that should not exist, landscapes shifting, skies pulsating with color patterns, whispers of knowledge that pierced the mind directly. The Watchers were exposed to these effects firsthand, many succumbing to fear-induced paralysis or madness. Those who survived were left with fragmented recollections, their notes littered with symbols and warnings that made sense only in hindsight. Physically, the valley became an arena of impossible events. Objects levitated and moved with intent. Natural phenomena occurred in exact synchronicity with the twins' emotions, and anomalies multiplied exponentially. Attempts to flee the valley often failed. Roads seemed to fold in on themselves, guiding the uninvited back toward the epicenter. Reality, as humans understood it, was no longer fixed. It was a pliable medium, shaped by consciousness, and the twins' awareness now dominated it. The Watchers realized, too late, that the true danger was never the twins themselves, but the very act of trying to dominate them. In seeking control, they had triggered a feedback loop that amplified the twins' abilities, creating consequences that could no longer be predicted or mitigated. The valley had become a crucible where human obsession collided with forces far older, more intelligent, and infinitely more patient than any mortal mind. From this point forward, every action, every thought, every observation was no longer neutral. The twins' presence ensured it. The world itself was now an extension of their consciousness, and those who dared to engage would be shaped, tested, or consumed by it. By now, the Watchers were no longer merely studying the twins. They were being studied themselves. The boundary between observer and observed had dissolved. Thoughts they believed were private began appearing in the twins' eyes, mirrored, amplified, and twisted into visions they could neither control nor escape. Memories long buried surfaced involuntarily, fragmented and distorted, as if the twins were rearranging the architecture of their minds to reveal truths they were not meant to confront. The psychological pressure became unbearable. Scientists who once prided themselves on objectivity now cowered at the sight of the twins' synchronized gaze. Attempts to rationalize, to categorize, to separate reality from hallucination failed repeatedly. Dreams and waking life blurred. Observers reported seeing themselves commit acts they had only imagined, or encountering scenarios that felt preordained. Those who resisted became disoriented, incapable of completing even basic tasks, as if their own cognition had been rewritten by an invisible hand. The twins' influence was methodical, precise, and terrifyingly intelligent. Every thought, hesitation, and fear was incorporated into a growing lattice of awareness that stretched beyond the valley and penetrated every mind that dared approach too closely. Agents reported feeling, watched from within, a sensation that no surveillance equipment could capture, but that left their nervous systems shattered. Even the most experienced operatives felt their decision-making override itself, subtly guided by an intelligence they could neither define nor resist. Physical manifestations accompanied the mental restructuring. Heart rates spiked in synchrony with the twins' concentration. Rooms grew colder or warmer depending on their emotional state. Shadows lengthened or split, taking on shapes that seemed to peer into the deepest recesses of the Watchers' fears. Instruments recorded patterns too complex to be human, magnetic distortions intertwined with neural signals, as though the twins were creating a bridge between mind and matter. The Watchers began to realize the horrifying truth. Their obsession with control had rendered them vulnerable. By trying to dominate the twins, they had unknowingly allowed their consciousness to be invaded, reorganized, and aligned with forces beyond comprehension. Each attempt to resist strengthened the twins' influence. Every calculated action only reinforced the lattice of perception that bound them all. A network controlled not by machinery or authority, but by the synchronized, uncanny awareness of two children whose minds were older than recorded history. At this stage, the twins were no longer simply anomalies. They were architects of perception, sculpting reality, thought, and fear in a crucible where only those willing to surrender preconceived notions could survive intact. The valley had become a place where time itself was no longer reliable. The twins' consciousness reached beyond matter into the flow of past, present, and future, bending causality with subtle precision. Villagers who ventured into the woods reported glimpsing events that had already occurred, or moments that had yet to happen, colliding in ways that defied comprehension. A single glance at the river could reveal centuries at once flooded fields, long-forgotten rituals, and future catastrophes unfolding simultaneously. Even the watchers, those trained to quantify reality, found themselves ensnared in temporal distortions. Clocks would run backward for minutes at a time. Notes taken in the morning were altered by evening, containing observations that had not yet been witnessed. Attempts to record events with cameras produced loops, flashes, and inexplicable images of people and places that did not exist, except perhaps in some potential future only the twins could perceive. The very concept of linear time became meaningless within their sphere of influence. Psychologically, the effects were devastating. Observers experienced déjà vu magnified 1,000-fold, and the sensation of being trapped in a loop of cause and consequence. Decisions that once seemed rational became impossible. Each choice reverberated unpredictably, as if guided by an invisible hand. Fear was amplified by uncertainty, and rational thought faltered in the face of a reality that could no longer be trusted. The twins had not only dismantled their minds, they had infiltrated the very structure of temporal experience itself. Villagers, too, were affected. They began to see shadows of their own past mistakes, lives that could have been, and moments yet to come, all layered atop the present. Some went mad. Others withdrew entirely, wandering the forests in reverence or terror, guided only by intuition shaped by the twins' subtle manipulations. Even animals exhibited behaviors that suggested anticipation of events not yet realized, moving with a precision that implied knowledge beyond instinct. By manipulating time, the twins had escalated their dominion over reality. The Watchers' desperation grew unchecked. Strategies that had once seemed plausible collapsed into irrelevance. Every attempt to intervene risked creating paradoxes that threatened their minds and the stability of the surrounding world. The valley itself had become an incubator of impossible phenomena, a nexus where consciousness, space, and time converged under the twins' unprecedented awareness. This is the point where ordinary human perception fails entirely. Here, cause and effect are no longer guarantees, and the very act of observation is entangled with consequence. For anyone who enters this sphere of influence, the rules of existence are rewritten with terrifying precision. The twins' influence had long since surpassed the valley. What had once been localized phenomena now began to reverberate across continents. Subtle patterns emerged in human behavior, entire communities acting with sudden synchronicity, inexplicable waves of intuition guiding decisions, and movements that seemed preordained, as if some unseen intelligence was nudging civilization itself. Scholars dismissed it as coincidence, yet those who studied anomalies recognized a deeper, organized rhythm underlying events. Technology, too, became a medium for their reach. Communication networks, electrical grids, and even satellites registered fluctuations that could not be attributed to error. Social behaviors, patterns of conflict, cooperation, and mass perception began to shift in ways that mirrored the twins' subtle influence. Markets oscillated inexplicably. Natural disasters followed unusual patterns. Ideas and beliefs spread with uncanny speed, as though the collective consciousness had been gently rewired, calibrated to a frequency no one yet understood. The Watchers, desperate and humiliated, realized that their methods were entirely obsolete. Instruments could no longer track the twins' activity, and predictions based on previous data were rendered meaningless. Entire branches of observation collapsed into chaos. Their obsession with control had been their undoing. The twins were no longer entities to be studied. They were architects of perception on a planetary scale. Even ordinary humans, far from the valley, felt the subtle influence. Artists produced works that seemed to emerge fully formed, with insight they did not consciously possess. Leaders and decision-makers experienced sudden, unexplainable clarity or dread, guiding societies down paths they could not articulate. Dreams carried warnings and symbols that shaped waking behavior, creating a feedback loop of influence that spanned cultures, nations, and continents. The twins had evolved into a network of consciousness that bridged human minds and the natural world. Their perception intertwined with reality, bending behavior, thought, and instinct in ways impossible to resist. They were no longer merely observers or participants in human history. They had become forces of shaping, subtle yet irresistible, steering civilization toward patterns only they could see. At this stage, the world had become a canvas, and the twins were the unseen artists, painting with thought, emotion, and awareness. Any attempt to interfere only intensified their influence, further binding human behavior to the invisible lattice they had constructed. The Watchers' failure was no longer contained to scientific miscalculations. It had become institutional. Governments, corporations, and clandestine organizations found themselves entangled in anomalies they could neither explain nor control. Reports flooded in, intelligence networks disrupted, classified operations failing without cause, surveillance systems producing impossible data loops. Entire agendas were compromised by patterns that traced back invisibly to the twins' expanding awareness. Powerful organizations accustomed to secrecy and control were exposed as fragile, brittle, and blind. Strategies meticulously planned over years unraveled within days. Key decision-makers began making choices they could not justify, acting on intuitions and warnings that appeared spontaneously. Even elite task forces trained in manipulation and deception found their efforts neutralized. It was not sabotage, not human error. It was something older, more intelligent, reshaping the rules of engagement. Financial systems, too, reflected the twins' subtle influence. Markets shifted inexplicably. Communications misfired. Decisions that should have been rational were overridden by patterns that resembled distant calculations of cause and effect. Institutions tried to respond with traditional power surveillance, enforcement, and manipulation. Yet the twins' awareness threaded through every action, anticipating moves before they were made and reshaping perception so that the world itself became a mirror of their intent. Even agencies tasked with monitoring human anomalies found themselves reporting contradictions in their own conclusions. Data conflicted, instruments failed, and analysts experienced mental fatigue so severe that teams dissolved without explanation. Hidden agendas, the backroom machinations of elites, were laid bare not by whistleblowers or leaks, but by the invisible influence radiating from two children whose presence reshaped consciousness itself. By now, the twins were no longer phenomena to be contained. They had become a systemic force, penetrating hierarchies, exposing weaknesses, and demonstrating that no human apparatus, no matter how sophisticated, could wrest control from their awareness. The world was being forced to acknowledge a truth that few could articulate. The frameworks built to govern, manipulate, and dominate were irrelevant in the face of intelligence older, faster, and far more expansive than any human mind. And so, the battle between human institutions and unseen consciousness had reached its tipping point. The Watchers' desperation intensified, the twins' influence expanded, and the world stood at the precipice of a reality that was no longer fully human. The subtle influence of the twins had become overt. No longer confined to the valley or isolated observers, their awareness now rippled across towns, cities, and regions. Ordinary people, those who had never heard of the twins, reported strange synchronicities, fleeting visions, déjà vu magnified beyond comprehension, and emotions not their own shaping decisions and behaviors. The veil separating reality from perception had thinned, and in some places it began to tear. Mass gatherings, even in distant urban centers, experienced distortions. Commuters claimed streets seemed to stretch or compress unnaturally. People glimpsed impossible geometries in buildings, colors outside the spectrum of normal perception, or faces that flickered between familiar and alien. Dreams spilled into waking life, compelling individuals to act on knowledge they could not consciously explain. Artists, inventors, and thinkers began producing creations they could not consciously replicate, as though their cognition had been partially rewritten by the twins' influence. Media, technology, and communication systems reflected the shift. Signals warped, broadcasts contained subtle patterns, and screens displayed images that viewers swore they had not seen before. People began to question their own memories, unsure which events had truly occurred and which were manifestations of the twins' invisible guidance. Entire communities moved in synchrony, acting as if a hidden conductor directed collective thought, not through fear, but through awareness itself. Even governments noticed. Reports of mass hallucinations, inexplicable behavioral trends, and sudden, coordinated events could no longer be ignored. Analysts struggled to determine cause and effect. Policies designed to maintain order faltered as populations acted unpredictably, often in ways that anticipated crises before they fully unfolded. Humanity's confidence in its control over reality was unraveling. The twins' power had transcended individual perception. They had begun to shape collective consciousness, exposing the fragility of human assumptions about reality. The veil between what is seen and what is imagined had dissolved, leaving a world where truth was no longer absolute and every observation carried the potential for revelation or destruction. The stage was set for consequences beyond comprehension. The twins were no longer passive anomalies, they were the architects of perception itself, rewriting the boundaries of human experience on a mass scale and forcing every observer to confront the instability of the world they had long assumed to be real. The subtle ripples of influence had become a tide. The twins' consciousness, once confined to perception and thought, now reached into the physical world with undeniable force. Storms would shift direction at a glance, rivers rose and fell without reason, and the earth itself seemed to pulse beneath human feet. Entire regions experienced inexplicable events. Buildings warped, machinery malfunctioned simultaneously, and animals fled areas hours before natural disasters struck. Cause and effect no longer obeyed human logic, the twins had rewritten it. Observers tried to document these events. Satellites captured inexplicable flashes of energy. Seismic equipment registered activity that defied tectonic explanations. Witnesses described lights moving across the sky in deliberate patterns, as though the atmosphere itself were under command. Flights were rerouted by forces unseen. Power grids surged without warning, and weather anomalies appeared in impossible locations. Humanity had encountered chaos generated by intention, a deliberate reshaping of physical reality by minds that were not bound by the limitations of ordinary humans. Even the watchers themselves, who had once orchestrated observation with precision, became collateral damage. Teams sent to study anomalies were caught in sudden storms, trapped by landslides, or rendered unconscious by forces no instrument could measure. The twins' influence was no longer subtle. It was immediate, intelligent, and dangerous, capable of transforming the environment to punish, protect, or manipulate those who intruded. Villagers long attuned to the twins witnessed a crescendo of events that blurred the line between miracle and disaster. Animals acted with prescience, buildings reoriented themselves along strange alignments, and objects defied gravity. The valley itself became a nexus where human understanding faltered. Ordinary physics, logic, and expectation no longer applied. Every action, every movement, carried consequences that were simultaneously predictable and utterly alien. The twins were no longer anomalies or even threats in the conventional sense. They were catalysts, capable of triggering cascading events that affected minds, bodies, and landscapes simultaneously. Humanity's most fundamental assumptions about causality, safety, and reality itself were being dismantled. The Watchers' failure was total, their obsession now a liability, and the world itself was being rewritten under the unseen, uncanny influence of two children who had become forces of nature. By this point, the twins' power had reached its zenith. Their awareness no longer simply influenced reality, it orchestrated it. Every thought, intention, and emotion flowed seamlessly into the environment, bending physical laws, perception, and even probability itself. Mountains trembled, rivers carved impossible paths, and weather obeyed their consciousness with precision. The valley was no longer a location, it had become a manifestation of the twins' mind, an extension of their will where human laws of physics and causality were obsolete. The Watchers, frantic and overextended, attempted one final series of interventions. They deployed technologies, rituals, and strategies that spanned science and esoterica alike, hoping to regain control. But each attempt was anticipated, reflected, and magnified by the twins' intelligence. What they intended as containment became catastrophe. Energy fields exploded, instruments imploded, and teams were caught in feedback loops of perception and reality that left them broken or vanished. Every action to dominate the twins accelerated the unraveling of human control, producing consequences beyond comprehension. Even distant regions felt the effects. Earthquakes struck without warning, sudden floods appeared in previously dry zones, and atmospheric anomalies distorted weather systems globally. Humans began experiencing simultaneous visions, past, present, and future colliding, as if the twins' consciousness had become a lens through which the collective mind was forced to view reality. Institutions, armies, and governments discovered their systems failing at once, their efforts irrelevant against a force that did not operate within conventional limitations. Yet the twins themselves remained calm, even detached. They were no longer children in any conventional sense. They were the axis around which reality now spun, able to manipulate events, perception, and physical laws with absolute authority. Those who had sought to exploit them realized too late that their obsession had handed the twins absolute leverage over both the world and the minds of those who once sought to control them. Humanity had been confronted with a truth it was unprepared to grasp: that intelligence unbound by the rules of matter, time, and causality cannot be contained. Every attempt at domination had only served to accelerate exposure to forces beyond understanding. The valley, once isolated, had become the epicenter of a new paradigm, one in which humans were no longer the masters of their reality. The twins' legacy was no longer a secret, nor could it be confined to the valley. Their consciousness, intertwined with land, thought, and perception, had fundamentally altered the way humans experienced reality. Those who had glimpsed their influence, whether villagers, observers, or distant populations, carried an indelible mark, a shift in awareness that could never be undone. Memory, intuition, and perception itself had been recalibrated, leaving a permanent echo of the twins' presence in every thought. The Watchers who survived were forever changed. Their obsession with control had been punished not by direct violence, but by exposure to truths beyond comprehension. Their minds, once tools of observation and dominance, had become mirrors of the twins' consciousness. Some lapsed into madness. Others gained forbidden insight, a clarity paired with the terror of knowing that the fabric of reality itself was pliable, responsive, and ultimately governed by forces far older and more intelligent than humanity. Across the world, subtle ripples continued to spread. Entire communities acted in ways that seemed preordained. Dreams carried coded messages of warning and revelation. Natural systems adjusted in imperceptible ways, reflecting patterns of thought that were no longer strictly human. Civilization itself had been nudged, shaped, and partially awakened to a reality that existed beneath the veil of ordinary perception. A lattice of consciousness in which the twins remained at the center, unchallenged and eternal. The valley, once isolated, became a symbol of transformation. Travelers who entered emerged with fragments of knowledge that defied language, compelling them to question everything they had assumed about time, matter, and free will. The twins' presence was a permanent reminder that human understanding is always provisional, fragile, and subject to forces beyond comprehension. Those who resisted this truth were broken. Those who embraced it were forever changed, capable of perceiving layers of existence most would never recognize. And so, the final lesson remains: power, awareness, and perception are inseparable. Two children, bound by mystery and an ancient intelligence, had unraveled the illusions of human mastery. The Watchers' failure, the global anomalies, and the mass shifts in consciousness were not accidents. They were the natural consequence of encountering intelligence unbound by human limitation. For anyone who has glimpsed this truth, life can never return to its former state. The world will always carry the echo of what they unleashed, and reality itself will remain forever altered in ways the human mind is only beginning to comprehend. This is the shadow of the twins' legacy, a permanent fracture in understanding, a dangerous knowledge that changes everything for anyone brave enough or foolish enough to see it.